Well, thank you, and it's a great pleasure to be back in this room for the first time in 40 years. And I would, like some of the voices we've heard earlier, I would love to be opposing this motion and showing faith in net zero by 2035. But, and I also think of myself in some ways as an optimist. In fact, lots of people say to me, how do you manage to be so optimistic in the face of things? And I say, well, actually, I'm optimistic in the sense of it's not proven that we can't get out of this. There is everything to play for, but we are absolutely throwing the dice. And what we won't get out of it, what we won't get through this with, is by kind of pipe dream, unrealistic sense of just, oh yeah, we'll be fine. We need to look realistically at the situation we're in. So to stand back for a second, to have a look at where we're at, humanity has entered this era called the Anthropocene, big word. I just use it to mean the age in which suddenly it's humans that are the biggest thing by far that are affecting the planet that we're on, affecting our ecosystem. And we've been in this Anthropocene for a few decades, a while. We can argue about exactly how long. But we've had a few decades of being able to get away with living as if we weren't, as if we were still in the old days when the world was, broadly speaking, a robust playground of a planet that we could do what we like with, and it could more or less put itself back together again. And those days are over. 100 years ago, we couldn't smash the whole place up, even if we tried. Now, we don't have to try to smash it up. We just have to not be more careful than we've ever been before. And we are finding that we are smashing the place up. And actually, most of the planet smashing that's ever gone on by humans has gone on since I was last standing in this room. So let's have a look. So climate, we talk about the climate breakdown quite a bit, and it's one symptom, actually, of something that's much bigger that's going on, which is our failure to find an Anthropocene fit way of carrying ourselves as a species. And we've just sticking with climate for a moment. I mean, there's much more to it than climate. There's a whole load of environmental things. We don't talk about biodiversity as much, but it's just as important as climate. Another way of putting it would be to say that it's a polycrisis. We're heading into a polycrisis. And in fact, we're not just heading into it, we're accelerating into it. So what do I mean by that? Just have a look at climate for a minute. If I was to show one graph, it'd be a graph of global emissions. And it's pretty well a straight line. If you were on Mars looking at that graph, you'd see a little dent for a financial crisis and a slightly bigger dent for a pandemic and something for the dissolution of the Soviet Union a few decades ago. But you wouldn't see any evidence at all, no evidence at all, that humans have noticed that climate change might be a deal that we should be doing something about. And I say that after 27 COPs and all the rest, 27. Count them, 27 COPs, and we're still not talking clearly in the outputs of those COPs about the obvious thing to leave the fossil fuel properly in the ground. So, in the face of all that, what are we being asked to have faith in tonight? So, what do we mean by net zero by 2035? Well, climate change is a global thing, so the most sensible thing would be to be saying, well, we mean global net zero by 2035. So what we're saying is that within 12 short years, we're going to take this rising trajectory that hasn't shown the faintest hint of a dent yet, which is actually we're making climate change worse at a faster rate every year than we were the year before, not just heading for trouble, accelerating into trouble. We're going to turn that around, and in 12 short years, we're going to turn that, we're going to take that right down to net zero, and that means we're suddenly going to have a level of international cooperation unlike humanity has ever known at the global level between Russia, China, the US, everybody. We're going to get together, we're going to do this in a way that doesn't cause mass starvation in Africa and all the rest of it. And it saddens me to say this, but that's unrealistic and we shouldn't be voting for it. And this House needs to be realistic. I can be optimistic, I'll be a little bit optimistic in a minute, but we need to be realistic within our optimism. And arguably, this House has maybe got something on its conscience, don't take this the wrong way. It has been the training ground for some very dishonest politicians, some of whom are still around. And maybe we can put the record slightly straight by at least voting with realism in what we call for. So unfortunately, if we had, dare I say it, listened to Margaret Thatcher more carefully in the 80s when she was banging on about climate change, or better still, listen to the scientists, we could be in a situation where we could be having faith in global net zero by 2035. We could be in that situation, but we're not, because we've ignored the science for a whole load of reasons, not least deeply cynical campaigns funded by the fossil fuel industry that has helped us, that has kept the science confused for a very long time. So, we can say, let's go for 2035, that'd be nice, but, we'd just be juggling, there's a gap between our action and our delivery, and if we tighten the target, that looks lovely, but all we're doing is we're saying we'll have less ambition gap and more delivery gap, or we could loosen the target and we could have it the other way around. But what we've really got to do is dent that curve for the first time. Huge challenge. We've heard things like technology. To be optimistic, technology, we actually have the technology to deal with all this stuff. I've written books about this. It's challenging, but we have the technology more or less emerging to deal with climate and biodiversity and food and inequality and all the kind of pollution problems we're getting, and probably pandemics as well. It's not technology that's the bottleneck. The question is, what is preventing humans from solving these technically solvable challenges? And that's taking us into a huge systemic and cultural and social change. It's unsurprising that an economic framework that was broadly honed pre-Anthropocene turns out not to be totally fit here in the Anthropocene. Same with our politics. You don't have to look around far to see that actually the quality of decision-making and the honesty of decision-making needs to be radically better than it is right now if we're going to get anywhere at all with this. So technology, if it was just a technological problem, yeah, we could be solving it. We've heard about BECCS and DACs, direct air carbon capture and storage. I've looked at that stuff carefully. Actually, it's a long way back. There is one scheme in the UK that in a few years' time might manage to take 1 million tons out of the air. There's a scheme in Iceland that everyone goes on about at Climeworks. It's doing 40,000 tons per year. That's nothing at all. And in 10 years' time, they're hoping to be about 10 times the size. Still nothing at all. So it's really right on the starting blocks. And it will never be the most cost-effective thing to invest in anyway for a low-carbon world until the fossil fuel is already almost all left in the ground. Go on, then. Okay. That's a question, not a point of information, but I'll ask it. I'll answer it anyway. It's being used by the fossil fuel industry to promote the idea that it's okay to keep burning the fossil fuel. That's what's dangerous about DACs. It's not the most productive line to go down. The most productive line to go down is to reduce our energy demand, and it's to push the renewables. But you know what? And this doesn't get talked about enough. The renewables are doing us no good whatsoever at the moment because we're having more renewables at the same time as more fossil fuel. And the renewables only do us any good at all if they replace the fossil fuel, and that will only happen if we do something to keep the fossil fuel in the ground. So, anyway, I've talked about the global situation, so let's talk about the UK situation, because it's easier in the UK. We're a rich country, we've got more headroom, there's more we can do. And we've got this 2050 target, which is not enough, but it's better than nothing. But we're miles away from meeting it, so we could ratchet that up to 2035 if you like, but we'd only be increasing our delivery gap to reduce our ambition gap. So, what would it take 12 years from now to get to net zero by 2035? Well, it would take radically better decision-making than anything I've seen in government. It would take honesty from our politicians. If I look at what is the bottleneck on this, if I look at all the bad decision-making I see going on around climate, actually it all has its roots in dishonesty. Dishonesty from the fossil fuel industry, but I'll give some other examples. Near where I am, there's talk of opening a coal mine on the west coast of Cumbria. And the fundamental argument for that was fundamentally dishonest. We pulled it apart. We got top expertise to pull it apart. The response to that was fundamentally just a load of rubbish. we rebutted that with proper, solid, robust evidence from top international experts in a whole load of fields. But Michael Gove came to look at the evidence, and he said, I looked at the evidence and I've decided to go ahead with that mine. And you know what? That wasn't just a mistake, that was a dishonest decision, because he selectively chose the bogus evidence over the high-quality evidence. And that's clear-cut. And I'm going to look to you two now, because these are people in your party that are being knowingly and clearly dishonest. And it's up to you. You, like all of us, should be standing up to them and calling that out, because we've got to improve the standards of honesty that we've got. No, thanks. I've done one. Okay, so some other examples. So Robert Jenrick also failed to call in the decision over that coal mine, saying it was just a local decision. Just a local decision? This is millions of tons worth of carbon affecting the whole world just before COP27, at a time when the whole world is looking at whether we're stupid enough to go with that coal mine. So, okay. I'm hoping this House will vote for realism, because the idea of net zero by 2035 in the UK in 12 short years, to go from a serially dishonest government that's talking a whole load of nonsense about climate change, with net zero plans for 2050, which we're not on track for meeting, and suddenly turn all that around and get to 2035. I'm sorry, but if we're realistic, that is not going to happen, which means we're in a very risky situation. We should all be feeling a lot of adrenaline around this climate breakdown. It's a race between tipping points. The truth of the science is we don't know whether we're too late. We don't know whether we've already triggered tipping points. The scientific community is just starting to get proper, serious, heavyweight interest in trying to analyze these cascading tipping points that we may or may not have already crossed. But to be optimistic, it's not proven either way. It's not proven that if we don't take very strong action now, all of us, that we can't, broadly speaking, get through this. The way to do that is to be realistic about the situation that we're in now, which means voting for this motion that we have no faith in net zero 35. And it means calling very hard for much, much higher standards of honesty than we've ever known in politics, in our media, and in our businesses as well. Can I just check how I'm doing on time here? You forgot to count. Fantastic. Sorry about that. That's great. Okay. So my note is so. Okay. I think you. Yeah. I'm okay. Good. Oh, okay. Okay. So my closing marks then. So the most constructive thing all of us can do is to vote realistically and honestly that 2035 net zero is never ever going to happen. However, if we wake up and push hard, and there's a big social wake up now, then we stand a chance of getting there. And the most effective thing that any of us can do, if there's one leverage thing, is to push for much higher standards than any of us have ever known in our politics, in our media, and in our businesses. Thank you.